Well, good evening. I'm glad you're with us. So we're going to look back into Daniel 11, and we're going to be reminded that God knows the beginning from the end. He knows all things. And we're going to see that reminder again, prophecy that is fulfilled through history, but we're going to even see some prophecy that has yet to be fulfilled and even take a glimpse into the end of time, the tribulation period. We're going to find Daniel 11. So really good stuff. Hope you stay with us tonight. All right, if you have your Bibles, you want to turn to Daniel 11. We are coming to the very end of the book. We've seen personal integrity and prophecy. That's been every single chapter. And we've been kind of going through in the second half of Daniel, there's a lot of prophecy. There's the 4 beasts, there's the 70 weeks, there's the ram and the goat. And chapters 10, 11, 12 are all really one unit and one continuous vision he gets that is going to take us from all the kings that would follow after Daniel all the way into the tribulation period. So we looked last week, a lot of stuff. We spent a lot of time trying to understand what was going on. And so we're going to do a little refresher, do a little bit more, then tackle the last part of this section next week as we hopefully finish up the book. Daniel chapter 10. There we get the start of the vision, but really not the vision itself. He is praying. Remember the occasion. He is praying because Israel, some Jews have gone back to Israel, but things were very difficult for them. So we think he's fasting and praying probably for Israel, which is always on his heart. And then he has the vision of Christ appears to him. And he's just overwhelmed by who Christ is. And this vision he gets is very similar to the one in Revelation chapter 1. Then Daniel is strengthened, probably by the angel messenger, who was withstood for 21 days. So for 3 weeks, the angel is prevented from coming to Daniel, but now the angel makes his way there, and we saw spiritual warfare. Now we come to chapter 11 and 12, which is really the meat of this vision. And what you find here, and I want to give you, again, a broad scope so that you can follow your way through. The stage gets set in the first couple verses, where it talks about Persia falling to Greece, Alexander the Great rising to power, and then Alexander the Great being cut off, like that horn that's cut off, and then 4 different generals come after him, and that's the next part. That's the 4-headed leopard, and we saw that last week. So we can see Persia falls, Greece comes to power, and then you have these 4. Then you have the kings of the north and the kings of the south, and they're going to fight back and forth. They're warring kingdoms that came both from the Greek Empire. Israel is going to be caught right in the middle. That's why we care about these two. Even the man we're going to look at tonight, Antiochus Epiphanes, really on the world history scale, not that significant of a player. But when it comes to Israel's history, very significant. And maybe you know that name, Antiochus Epiphanes, a terrible persecutor of them. But they're going to be caught in the middle, and the prophecy is going to be fulfilled over 200 years. And although it says the king of the north and the king of the south, and that it keeps the same titles, the person keeps changing for each one of those titles. So we actually see a lot of different kings, and we showed that a little bit last week. So that's going to be half of the chapter, and the second half of the chapter turns attention to one king in particular. It's a king of the north, Antiochus Epiphanes. He is a vile and deceitful northern king. He's going to set up an abomination of desolation. We'll see that tonight. And he's going to defile and persecute Israel, a terrible persecutor. In between the end of the Old Testament and Christ coming, he is the one that just really is a persecutor of the Jews. And so they don't really have much love for this guy. Then we're going to see the willful king. And this is where it gets really interesting for us because this is the Antichrist. And there's kind of a jump from Antiochus Epiphanes to the Antichrist. And we'll talk about where do we see that jump, how confident. Because if this is the Antichrist, like we'll say it is, now we're looking into the final years before Christ's return. We have the tribulation period. Remember, the church is raptured away. Then there's 7 years of tribulation where the Antichrist will come to power, and it ends with the Battle of Armageddon when Christ returns as the conquering warrior and he sets up his kingdom for 1,000 years here on earth. And so what we're going to look at is that 7-year period is when the Antichrist comes, and we have some mention of him here. And so this is very interesting for us. Prophetic jump to the tribulation period, and wickedness is similar to Antiochus. So you wonder, why? What's the flow of thought here? It's not all chronological because they skip some years and they skip some kings. But when they get to Antiochus Epiphanes, he is kind of the forerunner or the foreshadowing in an evil way of the Antichrist. And they're going to do a lot of the similar things really towards God's people. And so this is not a good parallel that's being drawn, but one is foreshadowing the other. Chapter 12, Israel is going to be delivered from this time of tribulation. And then the last chapter ends with some more instruction, some final timing that we're going to look at. So this is a lot. I've given us 3 weeks. We started last week. We'll finish up next week, maybe. We have a lot still to unpack. So let's do a little bit of refresher. And I'm going to move quick. If it's too fast, watch last week's lesson. This will give you more detail about these two. The setting the stage, and then the kings of the north going back and forth. So it started in verse 2 when it talks about how many kings are coming. So these are the 3 kings prophesied. And the 4th king is going to war against Greece, and that's Xerxes, possibly the husband of Esther. He is defeated, and so Greece, they have this hatred of Persia. And so when they finally get strong enough, here comes Alexander the Great onto the scene. And he conquers pretty much the known world in just unbelievable time. Short amount of time, he comes and he conquers. But he dies at the height. Remember, this was the horn of the goat that's broken off, and then 4 horns come up in its place. 4 other kings, and these are the kingdoms. And the 2 we care about is the one of Syria and the one in Egypt, because this is going to be the north and this is going to be the south. If we look at them over here, the Seleucian Empire and the Ptolemy kingdom. So the 2 kingdoms there. The south kingdom and the north kingdom, and right in between them is Israel. And so if you talk about, the center of this conflict, Israel, unfortunately, finds themselves right here. And so this angel unpacks this vision, or tells this vision to Daniel, and it's all about the king of the north and the south. I don't want to spend too much time, but I have to give you some run-up. And all of these are really setting up to Antiochus Epiphanes. So in verse 5, we learn that there is a king that is strong, and one of his princes will become strong. In history, Ptolemy the First was a king of the south, and he helped Seleucus become king of the north. He assisted him. This was the prince. So they started off really close. And then in verse 6 and 8, it talks about an alliance where she will be given, but her authority will be done away with, and those who support her will be taken away. And this is a political alliance. And we know from history it's Bernice, who was a daughter of Ptolemy II. So we've already moved down a little bit. And she was given in marriage to Antiochus II. Antiochus divorces his current wife in order to marry her, but his previous wife is influential and devious, and so divorce is not God's way. And so what happens is Laodice, who is his previous wife, she conspires and she assassinates her husband and his new wife and their infant child, and she takes the throne for her son. So it gets ugly very quickly. Bernice was given up with those who supported her, and Ptolemy III, to avenge his sister, comes and he attacks and he wages war, and there are the dates for that war. We get into verse 9 through 13, and we moved a little bit farther in history. And here we see Antiochus III, he wages war against Egypt, and Ptolemy IV defeats him, but he doesn't press his advantage. And so this is kind of how it goes. There's the wins and losses, and we see it through history. And there are dozens and dozens of prophecies here that we see through history fulfilled. And so if you're looking for a takeaway when you get confused, just know that what God spoke, we see in history. And this was spoken, hundreds of years before it happened. God is in control. It says the north is going to attack again 15 years later. And Ptolemy IV had died, and his son, who was very young, was in place. So he thought he would seize an opportune moment. But the Jews support the north, and they revolt against Ptolemy to kind of help the north, thinking this would work out well for him. It doesn't. Antiochus the Great, he comes from the north, and he finally is able to destroy the south kingdom. Ptolemy V is unable to withstand him, So Israel is now securely under Antiochus. So that northern kingdom of Syria, that is who they have now fallen under. Antiochus the Great tries to make another political alliance, and this we see in verse 17, 18. He gives his daughter, but the daughter doesn't accomplish what he was hoping she would. He sent her there to kind of be devious and work her magic so the kingdom would be weak so he could take over. But she preferred her husband, and so she revolted against her dad. And so Cleopatra is who this is, and she marries Ptolemy V. Cleopatra sides with her husband, and all the while Rome is gaining strength and battles against Antiochus the Great and imposes a debt on him. And remember, Rome is that fourth kingdom. You had Persia, you had the Medes and the Persians. Well, you had Babylon. You had Babylon, then you had the Medes and the Persians. Then you have Greece, and then you have Rome. And so Rome is off the picture here, but they're growing stronger and stronger. And now they attack Antiochus the Great and are going to frustrate him. Antiochus the Great, on his way back, he attempts to pillage a temple in order to pay back Rome. The people don't like it, and so they kill him, which is prophesied in verse 19. His son imposes heavy taxes to pay the debt. He has a rather short reign, and he's poisoned by one of his officials, and it says destroyed, but not in anger or in battle. So it predicts he's going to be assassinated. So maybe he should have read the book of Daniel, and he would have been a little more careful. So that, my friends, catches us up to where we left off. Some of you are probably fast and forwarding. Hold on. It's difficult to get through, but there's a lot of good things here. And what I want you to keep in mind is that God is in control. He's in control. Daniel is given this vision hundreds of years before these things happen. And some will say, well, there's no way, except Christ, he speaks and says, this is what Daniel spoke. Daniel really saw and really spoke these words that we read hundreds of years before they happened. So this isn't someone writing after the fact and plugging in neat little tidbits. All of this is prophecy given to Daniel that now we can look back in history and we can see it being fulfilled. And God's word is truth. And if it was true then, it's still true now. If the prophecy that we do have is fulfilled, the parts that aren't fulfilled yet, we still look for. And that's what we'll come across. But we need to look at this next man, Antiochus Epiphanes. And he gets a large section, really almost as much as these other ones, but it's the same person. So I want to read all of it to you, unpack a little bit of how this is fulfilled, and then we will look at the Antichrist. And we have our plate full tonight. So look with me in verse 21. So here is the next king of the north. So then in his place shall arise a vile person, we're in Daniel 11, to whom they shall not give the honor of royalty, but he shall come in peaceably and seize the kingdom by intrigue. With the force of a flood they shall be swept away from before him and be broken, and also the prince of the covenant. And after the league is made with him, he shall act deceitfully, for he shall come up and become strong with a small number of people. He shall enter peacefully even into the richest parts of the province, and he shall do what his fathers had not done, nor his forefathers. He shall disperse among them the plunder, spoil, and riches. He shall devise his plans against the strongholds, but only for a time. I want to keep reading, but just point out a couple things. This next king, Antiochus Epiphanes, is marked out here as being deceitful. He gains the kingdom by intrigue. He is destroying and wiping away those in front of him. He only has a small number of followers, but he is quite brilliant in the sense of using bribery, of deceit to rise himself up through power. And we're going to find he wasn't even the rightful king to begin with. So that's what we have so far. Verse 25. He shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south. So here comes another war. With a great army, and the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great army. So two great armies are going to clash. But he shall not stand, for they shall devise plans against him. Yes, those who eat of the portion of his delicacies shall destroy him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. But these kings But these kings' hearts shall be bent on evil, and they shall speak lies at the same table. But it shall not prosper, for the end will still be at the appointed time. While returning to his land with great riches, his heart shall be moved against the holy covenant, so he shall do damage and return to his own land. Pause there and we'll keep reading. So there's a war that goes on. The Antiochus Epiphanes is going to attack Egypt. He's going to win some victory. Those who support the Egyptian king are going to betray him. And so again, intrigue is being used, and Antiochus Epiphanes is conquering and making war. Then there's an alliance that they don't really keep, and then he returns, and on his way back, we really get the second mention of him doing damage to Israel and against the Holy Covenant, and he will see he plunders Jerusalem. Keep reading. Verse 29. At the appointed time he shall return and go to the south, but it shall not be like the former or the later. For ships from Cyprus shall come up against him. Therefore he shall be grieved and return in rage against the holy covenant and do damage. So he shall return and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. And forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress. They shall take away the daily sacrifice and place there the abomination of desolation. Those who do wickedly against the covenant he shall corrupt with flattery. But the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits. We'll unpack this more, but I want you to see this. He attacks Egypt a second time. But this time ships get involved and he's defeated. He turns back. When he turns back, he turns against the holy covenant, Israel, and he's going to ransack and persecute and desecrate the temple, is what it's talking about here. And we'll see when he does this. And he's going to corrupt some Israelites in all of this. Verse 33. And those of the people who understand shall instruct many. Yet for many days they shall fall by the sword and flame, by captivity and plundering. Now when they fall, they shall be aided with a little help, but many shall join with them by intrigue. Again, intrigue, deceit. And some of those of understanding shall fall, to refine them, purify them, and make them white, until the time of the end, because it is still for the appointed time. So we're going to see a lot of persecution of Israel. So this man is not a fan favorite for Israel. They do not like Antiochus Epiphanes. He would be known as a very terrible persecutor. So let's look at this a little bit more closely and how we see this in history. This next king. All right. In verse 21, he's called a vile person. His name is Antiochus. He's really actually Antiochus the Fourth, but he's called Antiochus Epiphanes, which means the glorious one. A self-given title. I am Antiochus the glorious one. Well, Epiphanes was what he called himself, but there's a play on words where they called him Epimenes, which means madman. And that was their nickname for him, which is pretty apt. This guy is crazy. He uses intrigue and deceit. He's brute force, a violent persecutor. So this is not a good person we're looking at. It says, he will not give the honor of royalty, and he seizes the kingdom by intrigue. That's verse 21. What's going here? Well, he wasn't the rightful heir. His nephew actually was. But again, this plotting and scheming is right up his alley. And so he takes the throne for himself, even though he wasn't in line for the throne. So this is what it's talking about. Not give the honor of royalty, because he was not royalty. He usurped the throne for himself through intrigue, which is the theme for this guy. In verse 22, he wipes out the opposition to strengthen his rule. One of the things I want to point out in verse 22, it says, let's see where we are. Even the prince of the covenant. The covenant would have been the covenant that God made with Israel, and this is referring to the high priest. And one of the things that he wanted to do was to Hellenize his entire kingdom, which basically means he wants them all to have the same religion, the same language, the same culture, because then they won't rebel. They'll feel like they are one. Greece did this a lot. They brought Hellenization with them, and so people learned their language and the culture. And Antiochus tried to do this with his kingdom. Well, Israel is very resistant to this because they hold to the God of the Bible. And they hold to their sacrifices. No, they won't accept outside. Those were the pagans, and they wouldn't do it. Well, if you oppose him in this way, it's not going to go well for you. And that's what kind of makes Israel an easy target for him. They don't have a kingdom of their own. They're constantly being overrun back and forth. And so now when they won't basically submit to what he wants to do, he hates them. And so he kills their high priest, Onias III, we know from history, and he puts his own high priest in there. He says, all right, you know what? I'm going to corrupt this, and I'm going to make it my own. I'll put someone in there who'll do what I want. And this is the first step towards persecution and desecration of Israel and the temple that he takes. In verse 23 and 24, it talks about making a league, an agreement, and then breaking it with them. There was a king and his brother that Antiochus made an alliance with, he plotted with, and they helped him gain power, and they supported him. But once he had what he wanted, he put them away and didn't need them anymore. It was all about himself. Again, he speaks out of both sides of his mouth. He would have been a great politician today, right? This is Antiochus for you. Deception and brute force is his trademark. And it says he even uses bribery. At the end of verse 24, he disperses the plunder and spoil and riches. He wasn't so much about getting rich and hoarding the money. He used his money, he distributed the plunder really to lay the groundwork for him to take more power. And you bribe people and you flatter and you all this plotting is really what he does here. Verse 25 and 26. When the kingdom finally is established, and he's plotted and schemed enough where he's firmly on the throne, he makes off towards a war toward Egypt. Verse 25. He stirs up his power and courage against the king of the south with a great army. So he comes and fights, and we know from history, Israel, under Ptolemy IV, comes and wars against him. But I don't know if Antiochus Epiphanes had anything to do with it, but those who supported Ptolemy IV, they betray him. And in that battle, they work against him, and so he is defeated, even though he has a great army. And Antiochus Epiphanes is now in control, and he plunders the southern kingdom. Doesn't take every single bit. I think the capital holds out against him, but he plunders the kingdom, and he comes back filthy rich. After he plunders the kingdom, the next king comes and makes an agreement. And it says they sit at a table, they talk to each other, make promises, but neither one of them actually keep their promises. And that's what you find in history. The next king after him sat down and made agreements and alliances, and they didn't keep any of them. They attacked, and they didn't hold up their end. So what he does is he returns. And at the end of verse 27 and 28, it says in verse 28, while returning to his land with great riches, so he's plundered Egypt, his heart shall be moved against the holy covenant. So he's already killed the prince of the covenant, the high priest. Now he's coming back, and he still hates these Jews. He's feeling full of himself, so he does damage as he returns to his own land. So he comes in and he wrecks Jerusalem again, and he is going to plunder the temple. And we know the year he does this in 169 BC. So we're almost 200 years before Christ comes onto the scene. Here is what the Jewish nation is going under. In verse 29 and 30, he comes a second time against Egypt. He comes to plunder and to finish the conquest. But something different happens here. I want to read this to you because it's interesting to see. It says, but it shall not be like the former or the latter. For ships from Cyprus shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved and return in rage against the holy covenant and do damage. What happens here is he comes again the second time, and he's ready to win again. He's going to take it all, take the capital city, plunder it again, and just have complete control. Well, Egypt reached out to Rome, and they pleaded with Rome to come and intervene because Antiochus the Great already couldn't defeat Rome. Rome was stronger, and he knew he couldn't fight on both fronts. So here comes Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus IV. He comes down to the south to war again, and there in the ships is Rome. And Rome gets off the ships, and they say, "You're not coming in here." The account actually goes, he wanted to talk to his advisors about what he would do. And the account goes, they drew a circle in the sand around him and said, "Before you step out of the circle, you must give us an answer." And he knew he couldn't beat Egypt and Rome, and so he goes away humiliated and defeated. He hasn't lost any soldiers. He has all of his army. He's all dressed up and nowhere to go. And so now he starts back in humiliation. And this is poor for Israel and Jerusalem. In verse 30 and 31, it says, "He shall return and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. Forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress. They shall take away the daily sacrifice and place there the abomination of desolation." This is a terrible, terrible thing. The Jews hated Antiochus Epiphanes. They did not like him. When they heard that he was defeated, they celebrated. They were happy. They were excited. Some reports came in that he actually had been killed, and so they all celebrate the death of Antiochus Epiphanes. Well, he comes back, and in his rage, in his humiliation with his army, guess what he does? He wrecks Jerusalem. You want plunder? I was denied there. I'll get it here. And so he goes, and it's not just pillage and plunder, but he does something terrible. He defiles the temple. Historians say he kills about 80,000 Jews. He kills and enslaves that many Jews. Just mercilessly plunders and kills in there. And then with the temple, it's desecrated. The Torah scrolls were burned. The sacrifices were stopped. He erects an idol, I think it's an idol of Zeus, that he made to look like himself inside of the temple and made people sacrifice to this idol, which would have been terrible blasphemy to do in God's temple. And then they would take the abomination that causes desolation. It's a sacrifice of pigs. And he sacrifices pigs and spreads the blood all over, which really is an unclean animal for the Jews. He knows this. Some commentators says he forces pig flesh onto the populace and making that's what they had to eat. And he goes through, and this is basically religious martyrdom. He comes through and it's genocide to kill this religion and to corrupt. And so this is a terrible time in Jews' history. The temple is taken away, it's being destroyed, and they are defiled. Goes on to verse 32. Some Jews are going to join him. It says, "Forces, those who do wickedly against the covenant, he shall corrupt with flattery." So some Jews, in promise of great wealth and riches, they'll join him. And they'll rat people out. And this is a terrible time where now the wicked who are not with God, Jews, who are not real Jews, they now side with this pagan and this blasphemy. It says, "But people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits." And that's interesting, that the great exploits, this is most likely referring to the Maccabean revolt. Maybe you've heard of the books 1st, 2nd Maccabees. They're not in the Bible, they're not inspired, but they are the history of the Maccabean revolt. And the revolt really started in 167. So right after this, those certain Jews had a high level of holiness and morality, did not accept this desecration. And so they go off into the wilderness and they wage guerrilla warfare against Antiochus with some success in all of this. And the Maccabees are a family, actually. And so the father starts and he's older and he dies. It passes to his son, passes to his son. And they have for almost basically 100 years, they are in revolt until basically Rome shows up and ends the whole thing. And Rome takes power in about 60, 70 years before Christ. And that's when Christ comes on the scene. And so God is working all of these things in history to set the stage for his son coming to earth, which is kind of what we're near on at Christmas right now. So you have the Maccabean revolt. Holiness was early mark of the Maccabees, even though at the end they became wicked and vile themselves. They would cleanse the temple in 165 BC, and this was really big for them. And they held out, and actually Hanukkah is where this comes from. So if you're familiar with that Jewish celebration, Hanukkah, it comes from the time of the Maccabean revolt. And so can you read 1st, 2nd Maccabees? Sure, absolutely. It's not scripture, but it's history that was written. So take it with a grain of salt, but there are true facts that are in there as they kind of lay out their struggle, and even some of the persecution is recorded in there. So it's not a bad side reading if you want to. Whew, this is a lot, isn't it? Hang in there, we're going to keep going. In verse 35, we get the purpose of this, and this really ends our account with Antiochus Epiphanes. Verse 35 says, some of those of understanding shall fall. So some of the righteous, some of the holy, they're going to fall, and it says to refine them, purify them, and make them white unto the end of time. And that's really a reminder of suffering and persecution. It's a testimony. It brings glory to God, but it even refines the church. And for these Jews, it was a refining thing, it says, even though they wouldn't have wanted it or asked for it. And it's a good reminder for us. As we suffer persecution and hardship, God is refining us and making us more like Christ. And so it's a great reminder. But now we get the jump. The jump from Antiochus Epiphanes, and it jumps to the appointed time. And really it says, let me read it, until the time of the end. And this is where we're going to get to the Antichrist. So let's read about the Antichrist. And then I'll show you why we think it is the Antichrist. And then we'll look at what he does. And maybe next week we'll look at how this fits into a timeline with Revelation. Where does this fit into the 7 years? And I can't take it all. We're kind of going breakneck pace as it is. But I want to look at this as it's written. And then maybe next week we'll plug it into the 7-year tribulation period and fit into the timeline that Revelation gets us. So let's read. Verse 36. Then the king shall do according to his own will. He shall exalt and magnify himself above every god, shall speak blasphemies against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the wrath has been accomplished. For what has been determined shall be done. He shall regard neither the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any god, for he shall exalt himself above them all. But in their place he shall honor a god of fortresses, and a god which his fathers did not know. He shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and pleasant things. Thus he shall act against the strongest fortresses, with a foreign god, which he shall acknowledge, and advance its glory. And he shall cause them to rule over many, and divide the land for gain. At the time of the end, so there's your time marker, we've jumped. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind with chariots, horsemen, with many ships. He shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through. He shall also enter the glorious land, that's Israel, and many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape from his hand, Edom, Moab, and the prominent people of Ammon. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt. Also the Libyans and Ethiopians shall follow at his heels. But news from the east and the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go out with great fury to destroy and annihilate many. And he shall plant the tents of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end, and no one will help him. Whew, that's all of chapter 11. Long chapter. Let's start with an easy question. Well, not an easy question, but an important question. Why do we know this is during the tribulation? Because if you read it through, it doesn't make it obvious. Okay, we're talking about Antiochus Epiphanes and all he's doing. And then there's another king, and he's going to war against the south still and does some more wars. And why do we say this is the Antichrist? Well, let me give you 3 reasons. One, this king is the final king that's going to lead all the way up into final judgment. If you glance at chapter 12, and we'll see this next week, in verse 1 and 2, we come to the end. It says, anyone who is found written in the book, so it's the books are going to be opened, and they're going to find their name in the book, and those who are dead are going to be awake, and some to everlasting life, and some to everlasting shame. And so this is describing the great white throne, when all the dead stand before God and there is final judgment. And this king runs all the way up into that time. Well, Antiochus Epiphanes doesn't fit that, and even the person after that doesn't fit it. But this man is like Antiochus Epiphanes, and so we get right into the end. So we've jumped a massive jump of years to the Antichrist. The second reason, in verse 35, it says, until the end of time. Same concept, that we're coming up to the end of time, and this is going to take us up until final judgment. Well, there is one ruler who's the beast, the Antichrist, and he is the one that takes us up into that time, even to where he pitches his tent and where he meets his end. It fits for who the Antichrist is. Last one, historic details, doesn't match anyone else. Doesn't match Antiochus Epiphanes, doesn't match the next king after him. Now you say, well, maybe God just got it wrong. Well, we've seen dozens of kings, specific details all along the way, and so it's not like, oh, it kind of messed up at the end. No, it's not like that at all. So when we look at the details of this, and we see everything historically is pretty simple to explain, or we can see it clearly if we study in detail, but this isn't. This is still to come. And this leads almost all conservative commentators to jump that this now speaks of the Antichrist. One like Antiochus Epiphanes, who now comes onto the scene. All right. Let's look, and then we're going to call it a night because there's a lot of stuff here. In verse 36 through 39, we read it once already, so I'll just kind of give you the highlights. You can pause it and read the verses and look at my notes here. He is called a willful and blasphemous king. Now, this isn't surprising, actually, because in the vision previously, we have already gotten this mention. Back in chapter 7, verse 25, as speaking about the horn, there's 10 horns that come from out of Rome, and then one horn displaces 3 of them. It talks about this. It says, he shall speak pompous words against the Most High. He shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change times and laws. Then the saints shall be given into his hand for a time, a times, and half a time. Basically 3.5 years. This is speaking about the Antichrist. This pompous words, this persecution of the saints, that's what, again, you find here in this description of the Antichrist. It says, let's see, in verse 36, verse 37, he shall regard neither the God of his fathers nor the desire of women. It's an interesting statement. Some forsake the God of his fathers. Well, who is the God of their fathers? Well, the fathers, it's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? Well, this would mean that this person, this Antichrist, this false Messiah, would be potentially Jewish. Now, he comes out of the 10 horns of Rome, so he could be Jewish, but coming from one of those countries that would very fit. It's thought that people will see this Antichrist as the Messiah. Well, you probably need to be Jewish to be considered the Messiah. So some see the God of his fathers, which he forsakes, is referring to his Jewish descent. It says he has no desire for women. Some people say, well, we know that the Antichrist is going to be a homosexual. He has no natural desire for women. It's possible. It also could mean that as the Antichrist, he has no desire for any at all. That's not what he is drawn to. He's drawn to power and destruction. And so it could go both ways on that. I think the Jewish has a little more validity, the God of his fathers. I don't know about the second one. And you can have an opinion. We don't have to part ways because of this. In verse 40 through 43, we find, and it's very interesting, wars. The Antichrist doesn't come on the scene unopposed. People are going to fight against him. And probably because they want power or they hate what he's doing, and he's going to destroy them. He has great, great power as a military leader. In the book of Revelation, you have the beast, the Antichrist, who's the military power. You have the false prophet, which is the religious power. And then finally, you have the third part, which is this demonic trinity that Satan is using. You have the dragon, which is Satan himself. He tries to set himself as God the Father is what he's trying to imitate. He's always trying to imitate. And so you have these three different pieces. But here is the Antichrist, the beast, the military leader. And he has wars. The south is going to come and attack him, and he's like a whirlwind. He's going to go and he's going to overwhelm and destroy them. Now, we don't know why the king of the south is going to attack him. We know from Daniel chapter 9, he makes a covenant with the people, but then he breaks the covenant and he stops the worship. And this is the abomination of desolation that Jesus says to look for. And so the thought is, well, if there's going to be sacrifices to stop, that means the temple has to come back. And sacrifices have to come back. Well, they haven't come back yet. So what could it be? Well, the Antichrist, very plausibly, could be the Messiah, their Messiah, the false Messiah, who restores the sacrifices, restores the temple for the first 3.5 years. The Jews hail him as the Messiah. He's brought the temple back. He's brought the sacrifices back. They're dying for it right now. But they can't because Muslims have the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem and right on the temple site. So if you're going to bring the temple back, guess what? That thing's got to go. And if you remove that thing, imagine all the Islamic, Muslim countries around them aren't going to be happy. Maybe that's what triggers them to come and to attack the Antichrist. And the Antichrist is going to gain great victories, and he's going to be established over Israel, but then he persecutes Israel. And he breaks that covenant. And just like Antiochus Epiphanes, there's the sacrifice he makes, probably of a pig, to desecrate the temple. He ends the sacrifices. He basically imitates what Antiochus Epiphanes, all the things that we just read about, he does as he persecutes God's people. More nations fight against them, and they're destroyed by this ruler, this beast. And then it ends, he sets up his army, it says, between the seas and the glorious holy mountain, and there his end comes. This is most likely Armageddon. This is the valley of Armageddon where he camps up, and that is where Christ returns. And we get the Battle of Armageddon in Revelation 19, I believe, where he wars against the Lamb as Christ comes back. And he is destroyed, and no one can help him. Whew. That is a lot. Next week we'll look more timeline with just the Antichrist and how it potentially will play. How do you get Daniel and Revelation? How do you put those together in a way that makes sense? We'll do that next week. I think we need to stop. We have a lot. Maybe you need to rewatch some of it. Maybe you need to read on your own. But that was chapter 11, 45 verses, a lot of history. But let me give you 2 points of application. And if you've zoned out, zone back in for 2 minutes, all right? First off, we already said it, but persecution serves a purpose. There is a purpose. It's to refine, it's to purify. And even when Israel was being persecuted and their high priest was being killed and all sorts of atrocities, God still was working something. And when we suffer, and maybe not a lot of suffering right now, but as it comes, God is still in control. And that's what we know. God's sovereign plan will be accomplished. And that's great comfort. To know that he sees all things. He knows what's the beginning from the end, and he can see into the future. And we have that hope that Christ comes in victory, and we have that hope. Let's pray. Lord, I thank you for your word, for just the reminder that you are sovereign. I thank you that you know all things, and even as we struggle to, Lord, see in the history how it matches with Scripture, God, you see it all clearly, and you see what's to come. Lord, increase my trust and faith in you. Lord, to commit myself to you, to know that what you offer is best. Lord, if persecution comes, I pray we wouldn't shy away, but we would even accept it, knowing that you have a purpose for your glory. We pray all these things in your name. Amen. Take care.